very pleased to present to you Professor Arie Kacowicz.
My last name.
Thank you. So, just a few factoids about the professor. This is by his full list of his accomplishments and CV. So he finished his PNMA at the Curie University of Jerusalem. He also completed a PhD at Princeton University in the US. He was later a lecturer, senior lecturer, associate professor, department chair there, and PhD advisor as well, practically from 1993 to 2009 on. He's also director of the Leonard Davis Institute of IR between 2003 and 2004, and Goldman Israeli visiting professor at Georgetown University between 2002 and 2003. He's also a PhD program coordinator for social sciences at his first university, Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And about his topics, the professor is expert in global governance, multilateralism, international relations, and in Latin America, especially. He's also dealing with the borders in Latin America and the relevance of territorial norms, and the South American recognition of Palestinian state. May I add that the professor is also interested in the topic of James Bond's movies and
Was never published.
and international relations. So I would like to ask some of you to grill him on that.
You're a smoker.
And about recent papers, publications, the professor is dealing with regional security governance. They have circulated, probably most of you have received that book with Galia Press, Nathan, and his recent book was Globalization and Distribution of Wealth, the Latin American Experience between 1982 and 2008, and his coming book, which is especially important, Handbook of Latin American Security with David Marish.
Andres and Detlef are there.
Yes. And this will be a little bit different format. Please prepare to be interactive and improvise. And I'd like to pass the torch now to the professor, who will give us a short presentation and then engage you in an alternative format.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Andres and to Pedro to bring me here. I just came early morning, 12:30 to this morning, after midnight, so of course I wasn't here before, but this is so far quite fascinating workshop. Within the framework of my time, what I would like to do, and I know that you already did that, and this is in a sense, the last formal presentation. I know your names, but I have no idea what you are working on. And what I suggest, again, it's a kind of different format, more of a workshop. I'm going to give a presentation. We'll be using all times the Blackboard. And then I want to turn the Blackboard and I want to engage together. I'm going to talk about global governance without defining it clearly. So the exercise I would like to do, I will get, I guess, feedback from you regarding the presentation. The points I want to raise is to try, and this will follow what Carlos, you in the morning were talking about concepts, right? So in a sense, putting this in context, what is it? Trying to define the animal, whether it's a new animal, and what's the added value. But for me, it will be also interesting to try to get in a minute to tell me, now that I know your names, what are you working on? So I know that you are Miklos and you're my chair.
I should start.
And please raise your voices, although I have a little device, I still have problems. It's the advanced age. Okay.
I'm working on reintroducing autarky concepts in IR in a different fashion. I'm also looking at the triggering mechanisms behind switching between autarky policies, sector-based or in general, and the more kind of free market-ish approach.
Autarky in terms of self-sufficiency.
Self-sufficiency, yes.
Okay.
Antigona.
I'm trying to do an evaluation of diversity or polemic
concept that is soft power. And in the case of Brazil,
Soft power in Brazil. Okay, and you work in Oxford, right? With
Yes.
And you work? Here with Andres?
yes, let's say here with an
It's fault.
by default, exactly.
Okay. Eduardo, you work in Brazil with environmental issues.
Yeah, climate change, environmental issues.
Andres,
I
you
know
know
what
what you do? You know, Beatriz, you're a postdoc and you got a new job. Congratulations. What was your PhD about?
European foreign policy. About European foreign policy vis-à-vis Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova, trying to look at the Eastern.
European foreign policy?
Yeah.
Vis-a-vis Russia?
Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova.
When? In a certain particular period?
I was trying to understand actually just practitioners how they conceptualize the field. So I was looking at identity, collective identity formation, norms, morality, and interest formulation, so energy security predominantly.
Okay, and where did you have your PhD from?
St. Andrews.
Ah, okay,
But yeah, and that's one of my interests, but other is methodology, because I look at the relationship between theory, method, and methodology.
okay. Sylvia?
Do you want me to say anything?
Sylvia?
No, I work with Brazilian foreign policy, but I ran away from the 20th century.
Brazilian foreign policy?
Yeah, and now I'm comparing Brazil and Portugal. Here, that's
Brazil
why.
and Portugal? In terms of here?
Yeah, I want to compare Brazil and Portugal foreign policy in the 19th century.
In the 19th century. Compare Brazil and Portugal?
Abolitionism.
From father to son? Okay, and you are working here with Andres?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Beverly?
Yep, Beverly,
Please. We do a different
Can join us.
doing my postdoc in Oxford, my PhD looked at notions of great power and responsibility, it looked at China and the US at 3 order-building junctures.
Great power and responsibility?
Yep,
Looking at China?
and the US.
Okay. So
then- sorry.
you are working with Andrew Harron as well?
Yeah, technically he's my line manager.
Okay.
And in the on-site
Isa? I know you're from Germany.
I'm working on EU-China relations.
EU, China?
Yes.
Okay. And where are you based? At GGG?
I'm at PSFI.
Okay. Martin?
I'm at the St. Petersburg State University.
That's in Russia.
In Russia. And I'm working on BRICS in global governance, especially on BRICS in global governance, and especially about emerging powers in global governance, especially about the BRICS in the WTO and the bridge in DORA agenda, especially as a Bali package.
Okay. Joanna?
I'm a student from the university and I'm still finishing my degree on political science and
You don't have to apologize about
I
that.
didn't apologize.
So you study here?
At Nova University, yes, in Portugal. I'm
May?
still finishing the bachelor, so I still have
Your first degree? Or second?
Exactly, yes, I'm finally
In political science?
in
International
international relations, yeah.
Here?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Do you have any particular interest?
Not particularly, but I like the international relations area, but I don't know how to precise any specific issue.
Take global governance.
But yeah, I know
Stefan?
Yeah, I'll be working on development policy, looking what Brazil is doing with South-South cooperation, focusing on discourse about South-South cooperation, but the research will be on what is done on the project.
Okay, and you're based here?
Now I will be at Rio de Janeiro. At PUC in Rio de Janeiro.
Ah, okay. Monica?
Yes, I'm based in the University of Hamburg, and I'm doing Brazilian climate change politics.
You should work with Eduardo.
Yes.
research is particularly on perceptions, certain perception, region or beyond region of Brazilian growth.
Perceptions?
Perceptions, yeah.
About Brazil?
About Brazil.
How Brazil?
So this discussion about followership, it's beyond that discussion because followership is more into the region, and I'm looking not just the region but beyond it.
How they perceive, how Brazil is perceived, or how Brazil perceives others?
No, how they perceive Brazil.
And
of
they
course, I have to understand how Brazil perceives itself.
Okay.
To see whether there is any exchange or mismatch between these perceptions, and
Okay.
and I have to until now a particular area like a policy area that I could structuralize.
Any particular issue area?
Maybe security, and I can define that environmental issues or
Okay.
energy and so.
Okay. Now we're gonna.
Now, yeah. I'm based at the Middle East Technical University in Ankara, and
Where?
Middle East Technical University in Ankara.
Ah, yes. Okay, you told me that. Okay.
Yeah.
And what do you?
It's a comparative study between Turkish and Russian soft power policies in the South Caucasus.
Turkish and Russian soft power
Policies in the South Caucasus.
Vis-a-vis their neighborhoods or what?
In the South Caucasus, yes.
Right. Okay.
Armenia, Azerbaijan,
Okay.
and Georgia.
Felipe?
I'm here at ICS with Andres and Bruno, and I'm studying Brazilian foreign policy in multilateral regimes.
Multilateral regimes, international, regional?
International.
Multilateralism, right? Brazilians love multilateralism, right? Okay.
Yes.
Your name, sir?
Can Berk from Turkey.
Okay.
I'm also from ICS, and I'm studying US-Cuba relations.
US-Cuba
relations.
Ah, we talk about that. Now they have to update your topic, right? December 17. Okay. Pedro, I know well, everybody knows what you do, right?
Yeah, which is what
Brazil, South
Africa,
right?
I work on Brazilian defense cooperation relations with Africa, trying to highlight it amid overall Brazilian African relations, try to explain from the Brazilian side and from the African side.
And Bruno.
Well, I'm based here, and I did my PhD on wars of decolonization and IR.
Legalization?
Wars of decolonization.
Ah, sorry, okay.
So it's a comparative study and then linking that with IR more broadly, planetary models.
Okay.
And now I work on a number of things, basically security issues.
So you are a professor here?
I'm a researcher here, and a guest professor.
And you still deal with the wars of decolonization, or?
I still deal with decolonization, post-colonial relations, the powers, small powers.
Okay.
A number of
Okay. I know that it took almost 15 minutes of my time. Okay, I mean it's within the 45. So as I mentioned, what I would like to do is just to put here on the board several points that they are related to the issue of the global governance. Again, I don't want to assume. I mean, I could assume whether you have read or not the draft chapter that I'm completing with Galia Warnatan for this book that I mentioned, Carlos, in your presentation regarding comparative regionalism, which is about regional security governance. So I will mention that. So basically, I want to, again, I didn't think about the formal presentation because I was thinking in the format of a workshop. So to put some ideas on the table following emails with Andres, and then tell the board, and as I mentioned, I want to talk, which is kind of funny, but we do funny things in IR, it's to talk about global governance without clearly defining what we mean. So there will be two questions that I want to, it's also very Jewish manner. So instead of answering questions, you ask questions back. Okay? So I want to ask you, or we do this together, right, as a workshop, after you hear the 50 minutes or so that I will be talking. Lecturers will say 50 minutes and I could go going, but I try to be disciplined. So what is it? How should we define it? And what is, and this in a sense follows some of the conversations we had regarding Carlos, and also that left your very nice taxonomy, right, about regional powers. What is the added value? Because I was, kind of funny telling Joanna, choose global governance, so you choose it all, right? But listening to the topics, right, we could put put some or many of your topics under the umbrella of global governance. So again, I was not lucky here to be here when Andrew Harrell, he talked about global order, right? But maybe, and again, the way that it comes, this is the last presentation, might, in a sense, echo or come back to some of the topics that he mentioned, and I admire what he tries to do. So, GG, it's not GIGA, it's not, but it's global governance, and RG would be regional governance, okay? So the first point, and this is essentially what Andres, you asked me to do. When we try to understand global governance, perhaps a starting point would be to go back to the literature about international regimes. I don't know how much you know about that. I can tell you, and again, my advanced age, when I was a graduate student, so international regimes was the new theory, right? Kind of the new concept, right? The one that in a sense embodies together realism with liberalism, right? In the late 80s, the international regimes, that was the way to go. Today we talk about global governance as the way to go, right? That was, and if you remember, Susan Strange wrote a very nice article trashing that. What's the added value of that? Now, what you could say, because in a sense global governance is the continuation of that, I would start with an equation, right? I don't do mathematics. You could say that in the 70s and 80s you had this theory about complex interdependence, right? Offered by Cohen and Nye, those of us who study IR. And to cope with that reality, so you have a series of schemes dealing with cooperation, right? In a sense, you have this idea of creating areas of rule, govern activity, that echoes what you said, Carlos, trying to define governance, right? Like the World Bank. So regimes, international regimes in certain issue areas, right? You are dealing with Brazil and multilateral regimes. That was a way to get to cooperation under conditions of complex interdependence. Okay? So my proposition, again, there's nothing new here. I would say that what we have today, global governance, that we still don't know what exactly it is. This is our challenge for all of us. As a workshop, global governance is supposed to deal with globalization, as international regimes that were supposed to deal with complex interdependence. Okay? So you have, if you want, you have here an equation. Again, you don't have to buy the argument, but we can talk about that. Okay? So, complex interdependence, international regimes, it was essentially about states. Right? When we talk about global governance, although exactly we don't know, it's like the story about finding the elephant, right? In a sense, we're talking, of course, about states, but we might talk also about non-state actors. We might talk about public, private, okay? So, and we have to deal, but that's another workshop, and I would like to do that workshop, we could define what we mean by globalization, right? But in a sense, dealing with the political implications of globalization, what we have today, we have this new trend dealing with global governance. First point, okay? Second point I want to raise here for our workshop, I would suggest that the literature on global governance, and this is back to the original idea that was coined by the late James Rosenau with the partner. They published a book in the, I think it was in the early 90s, like governance without government, right? And the idea, and I guess that probably Andrew Harrell referred to that, is that we could try to refer to global governance in a continuum between the idea of international order, which is the idea of international law and order of states, Westphalian order if you want, all the way to world government. We know that we don't have a world government. The UN is not a world government. Okay? So in between, we might have several stages. We might talk about a world society, we might talk about a world order, we might talk about cosmopolitanism, we might talk about this beautiful concept coined by, well, I don't know if it's beautiful, but I think it's a very interesting concept. Some of you might know Henry Bull, right, from the Grosjean, the English school. He coined this term, new medievalism. And I know that some of my German colleagues now, they talk about multi-governance governance, different levels, right? But the idea of new medievalism, that if you don't know the concept, imagine, we are back in the medieval ages, not in terms of brutality, although that happens as well, like with ISIS in the Middle East, but in the sense that you have overlapping spheres of authority, right? So, in that continuum, we can talk about global governance, in between the international order and world government, okay? That's my second point. My third point, and I think that this can be very useful as well, if we put my presentation in the context of what Carlos, you said in the morning about regions and integration and regionalism, and what you said about regional powers. And I think this is a very important distinction. We have to distinguish between global governance, whatever that means, right, in analytical terms, and Carlos, you are very much a positivist. I'm also a positivist, right? Well, I'm not saying that as an insult, the opposite, right? I mean, in the sense that we try, right, to think in analytical terms, right, put the variables, check that empirically, that's fine.
But I'm not positivist. I mean, I would consider it to be a very soft positivist among political science.
Okay.
It's the paradox.
Well, it's all about perception. But what I'm saying is that we can think about global governance, and this is something that we have to bring to the debate in normative terms. So, and again, here we might get confused, because we can think about global governance as an analytical concept, and my suggestion, and what I was thinking, in the morning, how to do the presentation, and I can read you the chapter that I wrote in 2012 about global governance. I can read the definitions, but I want to leave that aside for the second part. We will try to do this together. Okay? It's one thing to think as an analytical category, and we know it's not a theory, it's not a paradigm, maybe it's an approach or a concept, right? And we can think about global governance in normative terms. People like Thomas Weiss, he would think about global governance in terms of what the UN should do, or in terms of the question of global order. I guess Harry probably talked about that as well. So normative, it's a normative quest, it's different from an analytical one. And sometimes we get confused. I mean, this is a workshop about concepts, so I think we should draw that, distinction very clearly. Okay? Fourth point. Again, somehow you got this draft chapter, okay, and there I also have Gary and I, we are dealing now with the final version. This is a book edited by two German scholars, Thomas Risse and Tanja Borger, so they brought us free. They have lots of money, so we have 3 workshops together, and and still we are dealing with the implications of governance in a regional context. So my fourth point is that we can think about the concept of governance, which is a very ambiguous one, right? At different levels of analysis. I mean, the concept we got this morning, Carlos, from what you mentioned, refers to the idea of good governance, right? The idea of the World Bank. And I can tell you that David Levy-Farr, who edited handbooks are like telephone books you can use to kill insects, right? So I have a long argument with him that he understands about public policy or governance, but he does not have a clue about IR and global governance. It's not exactly the same thing. But we can talk about governance at the global level, which is the topic of this conversation. Well, we could think about governance within the state, right, at the subnational level, and we can think about governance at the regional level. And sometimes you get confused, because you can think about the EU as the ultimate example scheme for regional governance, where it also plays a role in global governance. And when we talk about regional governance, that was the comment I gave you, Carlos, this morning, because usually when we give comments, we always refer to what we are working about, right? Is that could be a way to compare across issue areas. So you can think about regional governance in the security area, but you can think about regional governance in the environmental area, you can think about trade, about development, about gender, about migration, etc. And then you can take the same concept of governance and apply that to a regional context. That's what we try to do in that chapter about regional security governance, and still the problem we had, and again we'll come to that to define this together is that the idea of governance seems to imply that we go beyond the state. That the spheres of authority, they don't refer only to state or interstate relations. That they might include new categories or new actors or non-state actors, etc. When you look at least at regional security governance, the way we did that, as a matter of fact, and in a sense, this has a conversation, Carlos, with what you presented, and it's also related to what you said. When you look at regional security governance, the easy way to look at this empirically is by tracing the regional organizations that deal with security. Whether they are specific, like NATO, or the Organization for Territorial Security in Europe, or whether they are multi-purpose, like Mercosur, that was not created for security purposes, but they also fulfill security issues, like Andrea Webster is the expert about that. Okay? So the question is that if you define governance including non-state dimensions, by the end of the day, when you look empirically, at least in the security area, maybe you still talk about states. And there might be a problem there that I would like to share that with you, okay, in terms of definition and concepts. Okay, so that was my fourth point. I think I'm talking already almost 15 minutes, so I will stop in 5 minutes. Okay? Now, the last point, and again, this is, in a sense, creating an agenda for a conversation. The last point I want to bring, and what, in a sense, interests me, and it's very much related to some of the issues that you were talking about. I'm interested in terms of a research agenda to try to see something that there is not much in the literature, but today I discovered that there is perhaps a literature, and maybe it's an interesting question, I don't know, you will tell me, is that if we have governance at different levels of analysis, so you might have global governance, whatever that be, that might include the UN, the G20, you are talking about the BRICS, right? The World Bank, the IMF, we have regional governance. But what, at least that's my feeling, it has not been explored so much are the connections between the regional governance and global governance. And this is the last point I want to raise here. For me, it's my agenda. I even got decent money. That for me was the first time after 22 years, so I owe that to my German sponsors, which is to try to say something intelligent, at least regarding the possible connections. Now, when we ask the possible connections, in a sense, there are two types of questions we can ask. One has to do, and this is definitely what you do with regional powers, regarding a typology. So what are the different types of possibilities of connecting global governance with regional governance? And what you could say, and again, if we think empirically, again, we can think empirically before we did the conceptual exercise of defining. So regional governance could be, for instance, could be Mercosur or UNASUR, looking at Latin America, and global governance could be something larger, right? Could be the UN or could be the non-proliferation regime, etc. So how those two are connected? And again, at least at the deductive level, and this is, I know that Carlos you like, and I also like this theory about cooperation, right? The possibility of cooperation. This is if I always tell my students, think that the opposite, and this is a question I can ask you, what's the opposite of conflict? In theoretical terms, what's the opposite of conflict? And Chris is smiling, but this is a good question, I think. What's the opposite of conflict?
No interaction.
No interaction in a sense, it's out of the continuum, because no interaction means that if you have interaction, it can be a positive or a negative one.
I come from.
We are playing with this.
I come from students.
We are students, but we are paid for this. Right? So what's the opposite of conflict? I mean, Miklos, I would put no interaction as one possibility. No. You see, I do this in purpose. No. Cooperation, somehow in the middle. What's the opposite of conflict?
No consent. Consent. Harmony, consent.
Right, harmony. Right? Harmony. Again, we are theory, conflict would be zero-sum, and harmony would be win-win, positive sum. Cooperation, which we have a lot of that in IR, would be, in a sense, mixed motive. Right? Cooperation would be mixed motive. Cooperation is not the opposite of conflict. The opposite of conflict is harmony. So we can take all those four categories, or types, and we could say that perhaps those might be types regarding the relationship between regional governance and global governance. I mean, they might be not connected at all, right? Irrelevant to each other. You might have zero-sum. Sometimes you might get regional governance in opposition to global governance. Sometimes they might overlap and cooperate, and sometimes you might say that regional governance might be part of global governance, right? And the second question to ask, which is the harder one, how do you explain that, right? How do you explain those different types? And again, at the deductive level, you might say there might be different factors. One of them is exactly what Detlef told us at noon. I mean, and you mentioned that, right? That regional powers might be those that might explain the links between regional governance and global governance. It might be a function of the issue area, right? It might, you know, as a former, not former, but Latin American, still you might play with dependencia like Rosso Faleto, right? You might have elites play transnationally in between, etc. Okay? So that's, again, that's a proposition that I bring here for discussion. Okay? So, as I mentioned, I will talk, and I talk more or less 15 minutes. So, what I would like to do now is two things. First, to get questions if you want to have. I don't want to damage the walls here at the Institute. Okay? So, what I would like to do, because we did something that perhaps it's not academic, right? I was talking like beating the bushes, right? Avoiding the very difficult job of defining what do we mean by global governance. So my proposition to you is to try to get from you together ideas. What is it? You know, this is like running the class, right? What is global governance? And the other question, which is a kind of criticism if you want, what is the added value? Okay? Because in a sense, I very much buy into Carlos the proposition of your presentation, although it's a criticism, right? Because in a sense, and if you follow the ISA, right? So there is a lot nowadays of talk about global governance, much more than about globalization. So let's try to think together. I mean, it's not an easy job, but if you want, unless it's kind of summarizing what you did this week, what is global governance and what is the added value? Okay? So I raised my point in terms of the presentation. Now we are supposed to have a conversation, since this is a workshop, rather than a conference, at least in my definition. Okay? So that was my presentation. Okay? So now, I mean, it depends on the style. You know, I can be like the noxious teacher telling, okay, so tell me what you think, right? Monica? So what is, I mean, we can go around, right? And we can get, because in a sense that can be an interesting exercise, because I'm those who still believe we can learn from each other, seriously, right? So we can go around, there are two questions here, and there might be also questions or comments that you want also to ask me. So you can, you can take the Jewish approach instead of answering, you can ask me back a question, okay, if you want. So, and everybody might play the game. So Bruno, although you are doing something else. Okay. So what is global governance? Okay. So what is global governance? What's the added value? Or something else, right?
That's a question. I mean, I think I'm too constrained by definitions that I know of. So I'll try to do something different.
Well, we can do like in domino. You can pass, right? I mean,
the added value, or the way it's seen as is this idea of being able to think about interdependence and governing globalization or interdependence without the need for governance.
Okay.
For world governance.
Right. So if I say it's beyond government, right? Although I would qualify, would say that, and again, you know that Thomas Ricci and Tanya Borcher, they are married, and all the time they have arguments. They have also academic arguments. So I'm with Tanya that she pushes, and it's also my view, that a lot of global governance is about interstate relations. So you cannot state. But there is a dimension as well that it might be, it's beyond government without being world government. Okay.
What I've read is that maybe the problem with that is, or one of the problems, is that you can see that as against government, as part of this corporate kind of governance agenda embedded in a way.
That it's against government?
That it's against government and it's part of this wider agenda of pushing back the public and favoring this kind of private standards or private contracts. I mean, you mentioned that in the morning.
So you would say, is this bad because you might have international corporations? Like, there's a problem like with the EU democratic deficit.
Yeah, right? There is that dimension.
Okay.
Deficit is also possibly bad in terms of its bias towards the big corporations, private interests.
Right. Some might say this is corporacy, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Arie, sorry, you are making a small trick because you first decide to differentiate between analytical normative.
Between what?
Analytical and normative intentions behind our concept definition.
That being
and now you have introduced a question by which response you introduce a normative element.
Right.
So
but it shows the problem when you try to get right that sometimes you cannot differentiate between those two.
You can, because you can say that in global government you have private concerns, but you don't introduce the normative view of that. I can agree with Bruno that I'm not very much in favor of private concerns, but the reason you want to study global governance, private component of it is essential.
Right.
So it's a difference how you value and how you conceptualize.
Right. And again, we have at TVU, which in itself is quite interesting, we got a German new professor, Christian Tower, who writes about multinational corporations in China and South Africa, how they are agents of global governance, and it's not because John Ruggie, that suddenly they became moral, it's because they want their workers to have good health, good education, and so on. And they are agents of global governance in his field. Okay. Yes, Pedro.
I would say that the added value for me to be...
You are not defining the real
I can go back to that afterwards, but the added value, I think it brings some sort of predictability through...
Sort of?
Predictability.
Predictability.
Between the relations of the respective parts of...
How do you see that?
Because it builds some kind of expectations as how they would interact among each other.
This is similar, by the way, when they invented international exchange, that was the idea, that you have expectations about the common behavior, right? Okay, what is global governance, Pedro?
Attempt to standardize issue areas or relations regarding certain issues.
Standards of issue areas. That sounds very much like international relations. I mean, if you remember Krasner's definition from 82, we are talking about a set of, what was the list, set of norms and principles and rules about how actors, essentially states, would behave according to expected behavior. Okay, if we go according to the order, that would be...
John.
Yes. You can pass.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have Felipe.
Well, what is global governance?
What is global governance? What's the added value?
I think one can define it as like the reunion of several regimes, like as a conjunct, as something bigger, or kind of umbrella concept that can have under it various issue areas, like go beyond.
Okay, that's interesting. Although what's the difference between interdependence and globalization, right? Whether globalization is a lot of interdependence together, so it's more of the same, or there is a qualitative difference. So you might say it's an agglomeration of international regimes will give us a picture of global governance, yes. Right? Okay, any other value?
I think you can try to add some normative value when you say, like that thing of good governance, bad governance.
Okay.
You can try to push some directions.
Right. Well, at least you can say that it might bring some of the normative discussions back, right? Okay, Leonora.
When I think of global governance, I automatically think to institutions. This is what. So it's I would define it like mostly like Felipe was saying as the capacity of states to cooperate,
right.
Create some sort of institutions,
right.
And the added value is to cope with the turbulence.
Right.
As you put
that's Rosenau, right? Coping with the turbulence, right?
And change, and trying to develop the change in the direction that these states want to go towards.
Deborah.
No, I would pass, but it's just because the first point, the beyond government, I don't know, for me, it's still like this non-states, not only states, but non-states. He is international institutions, but I think international institutions, there are several other players inside,
yes.
Not only states.
I mean, there are no states, and we can think about examples,
exactly.
Right? We can think, you have those companies that they rate the standard, right? They give the rate for countries, and those are private, right? Or you have, this is apropos regimes, but it's more than the regime, you have something called the Kimberley, right? The Kimberley regime about the diamonds, that includes also non-state actors, right? So there is a dimension going beyond that. Okay, Monica.
I would say it's like a set of norms and institutions also that go beyond the state level, that transcend to the states of equity.
Norms and rules beyond the state level. If you remember what Carlos said this morning regarding the concept of governance that brings a dimension of law or rules, right? Or maybe soft law, right? Which is essentially about regulation. If you take the definition in normative terms, would say, okay, those are the norms trying to bring about some kind of collective good or regulate the world. Okay, Stefan.
Well, we've named it, but as it's not on the board, you can argue for just the new actors which are there.
New actors.
New actors.
As the added value?
No.
As part of the definition.
As part of the definition.
Okay.
And well, I question if it's value, or I don't know if we just ask for the value, but anyways, it's that these new actors participate in rulemaking. That is a part of politicization or further politicization of society.
Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, you mentioned here 2 points that I would, I always paraphrase with my students, say this is about rulemaking as part of the definition. And the other, and I think that might be a difference with regimes. The criticism of Susan Strange is that regime, there was so much of politics, right? And when we talk about global governance, politics is there, for certain. Okay? Now, again, we have maybe this bias that when we think about those new actors, and you were right, Carlos, in your point that we are not neutral, but a multinational corporation, especially as Latinos or coming from the South, we have this, in a sense, this prejudice. But new actors might include, we think about Latin American security reality, it might be drug lords, right? I mean, there might be other actors that are the dark side. And what is interesting, and we have now giving you advertising the handbook that I'm editing, there is a wonderful chapter by Harold Trincunas and Ann Cluner, which is about alternative forms of governance. Again, this is not about regional or global, but they make the argument, which is interesting in itself, that in some cases in Latin America, narco-traffickers, they really might perform functions of governance when the state is absent, providing education. I mean, it might not sound politically correct, but that might be the case, right?
Hezbollah.
So the question again is who are those new actors? Whether we are including only the nice ones, the official ones, or we might include other types of actors.
And before we proceed, can I ask some question, or can I get this clearer? Because you were talking about cooperation, harmony,
right.
Conflict, and working and living together. Is this for you cooperation or harmony? Just to get it clear for me.
Well, again, I can tell you again, there are no secrets. Essentially, in IR we have this tendency of isms, right? And many times I confuse my students, but if I had to choose, I would choose the English school. And the English school is somehow in the middle and assumes that the reality of IR, what you have a lot of cooperation going on. And again, cooperation is not armor. And you might have, I can give you examples from home, right? Now I'm 24 hours far from home. Israel and the PA, okay, they are in very bad relations right now, the political level, right? They are bashing each other, politically speaking, right? At the same time, as we are speaking, you still have a strong security cooperation going on between the IDF, between the Israeli army, the Israeli intelligence, and the Palestinian intelligence. So you might have realities of simultaneous cooperation and conflict going on, right? So I think that you have the two of them. Now, regarding motivations, I think that when you get, and this is back, Carlos, to your team, and think about Mercosur or other schemes, you can explain that partly motivated by cooperation, partly motivated by conflict against the US or against somebody else. So you might have multiple motivations. Again, in a sense, this confuses reality, right? Because it's not just one ideal type. Okay? So and the other thing is that you have a lot of cooperation, is that cooperation is not always in a positive sense, right? Cooperation might be when two parties, they coordinate, right, their policies. It might be two mafias cooperating, right? So it's not necessarily, in normative terms, the best thing to go, but I think it really very much reflects the reality of IR. Okay, Joanna.
It's quite hard to define this after all these ideas, but I would say that labor governance is kind of an upgrade of the Westphalian order, because it is concerned with dealing with the security dilemma.
So it's beyond the Westphalian?
Yes, it can be in a certain way, because
Okay. Well, that's part of the argument. Some people might say when we talk about global governance, although it's not more comprehensive, it goes beyond the Westphalian order. And some people might say, no, it's still within. That's the problem with the concept. It might be international order, it might be more than that. If you remember from the country. Okay. Stefan? No, Stefan, that was you. That would be Martin.
Yeah.
BRICS, that's global governance.
Yes, complicated. Like for me, global governance is kind of a term that tries to summarize all attempts to shape globalization, all attempts to shape globalization processes, as well as by private, public, or institutional processes, actors. So it's not only the results, but also the trying and also the interest groups that try to influence on these globalization processes.
Right. I mean, I have in the chapter, I have like 6.
Arie, may I make a comment on this? This definition raises a kind of problems or singularity of regionalism. Refer regionalism to region, refer global governance to globalization. You translate the definitional problem for another term.
That's
you don't resolve.
Yeah.
It's circular, and this of this, perhaps one should have a little bit.
Right. This is when we talk global governance, regional governance, as he said, on the other side. So if it makes this difference, you can.
But then,
the question is if you want to do it.
No, the idea is, of course, mirroring it or making a parallel definition, but you get the same kind of problem. What is globalization?
Right, that's a problem of tautology. Right, you're right. But again, I mean, you can find a way out saying, okay, because some people might say global governance is part of globalization, right? Or it's like saying it's easy to say international regimes is part of global governance. Now, I think what Martin is saying, in a sense that you can say that global governance might be the political mechanism to cope or deal or shape or affect globalization.
So
globalization then,
you can define globalization. So you can say shaping or managing these growing interactions at all.
Right.
Can I add something to that?
Yes.
It's a huge question. What is globalization? When we take one of the first books I read about globalization, it was mainly a bilateral export of service issues from the United States to India. So like this outsourcing, this is bilateral, it's not globalization. It's India and the United States, but they call it globalization because of different regions.
Right. I mean, again, it depends if you define economic globalization, right? And or if you take, I think, it's funny, in IR we don't have good definitions of globalization, right? We take that from, and you mentioned that in your talk, that we have to learn from other disciplines, right? The best definition is by Anthony Giddens, who's a sociologist, right? That you talk about intensification of interactions with social relations, political relations, economic relations. Okay, that still might be different from global governance. Global governance might be how you cope with that, how you deal with that, how you affect that. Okay, that maybe most of the answer would be by the action of states, right? I mean, still my argument that most of global governance is done by states, but not only by states. Okay, we were with Inza.
Yeah, a lot of it is already there, but it is used as a mechanism to pool resources to deal with these issues, and I think it's trying to be very inclusive because the issues that are dealt with within global governance are said to affect everybody or every state, and I think it's hard to retreat from them.
Okay.
But in this sense, it can be exclusive as well. Like
what did you say?
Sorry, it can be exclusive as well. Like if you said, if you think of, for example, institutions, like the mechanisms of or
sure, but from the issues.
Well, again, you have an argument in the literature too that if you take that, especially in a normative direction, you can say global governance deals with mechanisms to pool resources, in a sense, providing collective goods.
Isn't that the added value?
What?
Isn't that a normative and added value? Wouldn't that be in the other part?
You have that there. I think we know that. I mean, you can say that normative, although it might be a disadvantage because it's get confused. It's very confusing.
But I mean, the provision of public goods could be an added value for global governance. Yes.
But it's included normative.
Yeah.
Okay. We are with Beverly.
Yeah, I think I would just echo a bit what Martin was saying more at the abstract level, that global governance to me is a response to globalization. So both integration and fragmentation of globalization.
Yes.
So the added value then is that it introduces, it broadens the amount of actors that we talk about and actors and agencies.
Yes.
But I guess if I were to add another question to what's in the board in terms of what is the limitations of global governance?
What are the limitations?
Yeah, so to me it seems like then it just broadens. Global governance can be like everything.
Everything.
Right?
Yeah, of course.
So
Well, it's a catch-all, right? It's like
it's like regions.
So, Beverly, 2 points on that. And again, this is a workshop we are playing with concepts in IR. You know, the late Rosen, I don't know where you manage. I met him, you know, and Rosenau liked to invent concepts in IR, and he has a concept which he called fragmentation.
Yes.
Right? Fragmentation as putting together integration and fragmentation. Okay? So, not really, but again, then you get to the criticism that in a sense it includes everything, right? So then there is a problem of how, again, this is against what we learned from Carlos in the morning, right? Like, that in a sense it gets very, very ambiguous, very, very complex. So maybe there is no much added value with that, right? Okay, we turn to Sylvia. Yes, of course.
Just a little comment. Although I understand that perspective, I think global governance can be also a response to geopolitics and to the security dilemma and to the classical division.
How do you see that? By having a world government or what?
going in the right direction.
Right. Well, again, depends how you define that, because if we are a realist.
No, I
Yes,
agree.
but there was this, not politician, but there's a
Michael Walzer.
Yeah. He did several regimes, you know, and I suppose that line is kind of interesting to understand how global governance is developing.
But you know what? I mean, apropos Michael Walzer, I want to tell you, maybe you don't know this. He once wrote a very nice article where, as you say, he had this cosmopolitan version, right?
Yes.
That you have to transcend the nation-state system. But what he said, wait, Carlos, he said, before you transcend that, it has to be completed. Okay? So, and there is a problem with that, because again, you don't have to be a hard-nosed realist, but realists, I think they are very smart, and when they suggested that you cannot have a super Leviathan, because then you would have a super civil war, right? So it's not as simple as it looks. Okay. Sylvia. Okay. Beatrice. It's a funny conversation between the two of us. You cannot talk and I don't listen very well. That's fine. My fault, that's yours.
I'm not a realist. I just want to add very quickly about the universality and kind of introducing values and kind of trying to understand it not just from, I'm not suggesting it's possible, but looking at global governance. And that's why, I guess my point is that there's a reason why we don't call it government or global government, because it cannot possibly be a government. You cannot create a global government.
Right.
Because we have all different understanding of what government is. All our countries work differently, even all our regions. So you cannot call it a government. So you use this word governance.
Right.
And I think, to me, it has a very, not just normative, but very valuable understanding of what is governance.
Yes. And that's very nicely put. You know,
you're looking for a kind of universality of how we should be doing things.
Right. And Andrew Harrer has a very nice article talking about this, the virtue of plurality, even if you want to move in a cosmopolitan direction. And again, I think that's also, for those of you who might know Hedley Bull's book on the anarchical society, people usually ignore the last part of the book, where he makes the defense of the nation-state system, coming to the conclusion that what you have is basically the best thing because the alternatives might be much more terrible. I mean, not we all, many of us might have this liberal bias, but liberal bias might bring us into crusades, right? So in a sense, global governance is kind of compromise, right? You might work in a universal direction, but you don't get all the way to a world order.
No, but I think it's all about accepting or knowing about other values and accepting them, that you've got to appreciate them.
Yes. Okay, so I will write universality and pluralism at the same time. Which is, for instance, if you know John Rawls, some of you might know, right? And Rawls is not Pogue, right? Rawls is not Pogue. Rawls does not take what he argues for the American society to be expanded into international society all the way. Right? What?
Neither Walzer that you mentioned.
No, neither Walzer. No, I agree with you. And I know the head of the Frankfurt Peace Institute, Harold Mueller. He once told me that Pogue is crazy. That if you want to implement Pogue, that would lead into a global civil war, right? That if you want to get global justice to everybody, who will do that? Okay? So this is, again, you might say, this is already normative propaganda. That it's arguing, as you say, you're right. Michael Walzer had this argument about he's a liberal, but he's not a cosmopolitan, right? Respecting states as a political community, like Andrew Linklater. Okay, the last student before we turn to our faculty. You are here also as well, Antigona.
Yeah, I don't know. I think everything has been said. I don't want to pass, I would say interdependency, but I think it's really going back to 70s. So I could say interdependency, or we all come together in a way that it's a...
Dependency or
interdependency in a way of the church board.
Okay, but the question is whether it's the same as interdependence.
Yeah, I know. So I don't know if I can answer that.
I don't know.
I'm trying to answer with a question.
Yeah, well,
I
let's
suppose.
finish with the skills. I mean, it sounds horrible. Let's finish with the skills. Let's end the round and enter the faculty. Miklos, you are my chair.
As opposed to Bruno, I had a lot of time to think, so I hope I didn't think too much. First, to agree with Bev, I think it is a response, but it is also an important question by whom. It really, I think if you look at the language of it, it shifts the focus on the combination of outcome and process. Governance can be understood both process and outcome, and thereby it is blurring those boundaries between outcome and process, but also obfuscate who the actors are. And that's a very important thing, because the actors are who bear that kind of difference, which is problematic to government. So government kind of tries to obfuscate that, or kind of bypass it, or whatever. Thinking in such terms also hurts, I think, the sovereign state. It's implicit that it pushes not only the democratic deficit, like Bruno suggested, but it's also removing the power from those who, or perhaps should have more in an environment of increased pressure from global processes. Not only trade, but also like, for example, asymmetric trade, asymmetric cooperation, the poverty it produces. Also, Martin White's English school, whatever, is strongly built on him, of course. Suzerainty is a very interesting concept here. So I think that if to use that concept which you mentioned before, like neo-medievalism, it kind of reminds me of the guilds, churches, and their special status within this kind of suzerain Europe. And the problem with this is that what was the first thing the so-called 19th century classic liberal states, after the successful revolutions, destroyed and removed as soon as possible? It was the INGOs and NGOs, which remained from the medieval period. So they abolished guilds, they reduced the power of the church, especially Catholic Church, but other churches as well, to different things in their territory, especially politically. And so it undermines state authority. It kind of removes these agents from underneath the states. NGOs might become INGOs and wield their own power internationally and become independent, like the Order of Malta or something. And so this is a very anti-state move. And this is, I think, in many ways, because of these Hadley Bull arguments and so on, very dangerous, because states can find themselves in a situation where they no longer, each of them, can control what happens next day, and that is even huger democratic deficit than just to allow decisions to be made by companies occasionally. Sorry, just one more thought. Andrew Hurrell's and also Hadley Bull's virtual polarity thinking is very similar to Aristotle's and Plato's thought on why we have democracy.
Right. Well, that's very interesting what you are saying, because in a sense you can have either a way to think about those issues within the interstate paradigm, maybe reform, or some might say this is a movement away from the state in the direction of other actors, right? And that's, in a sense, that's the ambiguity of the concept. It can be both. Okay, let's turn to the faculty. Then I will read you a couple of definitions that I have in the chapter. You'll see that, in a sense, it reflects this collective wisdom, right? It's not very different. Andres.
Thank you very much, Arie. This is beautiful. I will go with global governance or regional governance as I went with regional power this morning, distinguishing the noun from the adjective. Because to me, we are focusing on the noun and the adjective is regional. The noun, well, regional power this morning, to me, regional power is the most powerful state in a given region, and that's it. The thing is, what the heck is a region? And here, it's about global governance or regional governance. And governance, to me, is just the process of making and enforcing collective rules. Government is the authority that does this. But we may have governance without government. The thing is, what's regional about governance? What's global about governance? And I will call in our Delphi Alfred Tobias, who recently retired from the Hebrew University. And he speaks of cross-regionalism. And I'm thinking of APEC, TPP, TTIP.
Right.
Global rules, or rules today are being made cross-regionally, neither globally nor regionally. So I think that we should rather focus on this, the objective.
Well, that's your bias. Okay.
Vice.
Okay. Yes, either Eduardo, Detlef, or Carlos, or Bruno,
Okay.
you already talked. Yes.
Yeah.
Or Beatrix, your faculty back. So.
But the voice of the faculty.
Yes. Detlef.
I got.
Eduardo.
Okay. I mean, I would say that trying to follow what some said before, I think that this is a response to the deepening of globalization. Not just globalization, but the deepening of globalization. Okay. And to me, the deepening of globalization is strongly related to the moving in terms of the Holocene to the Anthropocene, in terms of geological. Now we are in a time where humanity is a driver of the planet system. Okay? So, one meaning was the meaning of global governance and the times of Oran Young in the early 90s.
Right.
Governance without government. Yeah. Another is now with the challenges in the 21st century.
Okay.
That is strongly related to the fact that humanity has already surpassed in a very risky way planetary boundaries.
Right.
Okay? It's the great acceleration in many dimensions of the and so this would be global governance right now is a response of to the deepening of globalization. It's a response of the challenges of the Anthropocene.
Okay. You sound like Al Gore.
It's not of my inspiration.
Yes. Detlef?
I think it will sound more like my colleague. No, but for me also, I think basically local governance, like regional governance, is about setting binding norms and rules. And I think what perhaps today that these rules are not only set by state actors, but in some cases also private actors or non-state actors.
Right.
And I think I would also, I do not see this close linkage between globalization as we understand it now in the last 20, 30 years, because I think there has been something like global governance before we spoke about globalization. There's, I think the League of Nations in a certain way, and also I think the United Nations was also
the UN, yes.
behind. But in
But
practice, is the private.
started with us. So
I think
really important.
So I think there might be interaction between local and regional governance, and I think also inter-regional, but I think perhaps we should also take into account these three dimensions, global, regional, and inter-regional. This is my value-added to our
Carlos.
Okay, let me just start
with what?
With an observation about the way you frame the second question. What is the added value? And when you put the question, I was thinking technology responses, but when I put the question, I was thinking about the earlier responses, but what I heard was the opposite, not the opposite, a different report. What is the added value? One of the responses can be what is good or bad about global governance. And this is the fact that almost everyone here took, with the right exception of initially Joanna, which said, going beyond the Westphalian state. And I would say why he looked at initially as something different. The different tack, and it surprises me that this seminar here, but it's perhaps because the question is very ambiguous, is what the epistemological, scientific
analytical
global governance. No one has responded to this question. There was an attempt when someone said, Joanna, going beyond the Westphalian state, implying that the obvious for analysis and the theories for analysis should be different. I don't know whether it's what you meant or not, but that would be epistemological question. Response, sorry. The others are more or less falling down in the line of appreciation and normative evaluation.
Right.
The problem is that the question was not properly framed.
Yes.
To edit, to extract the kind of responses perhaps that would be really functional in terms of this seminar, which is more epistemological rather than So there is a problem in the way this question has been formulated. The second question about the definition, I never try to define global governance, despite the fact I work in a program which is called Global Governance Program. Why so? That is what I consider to be the response to the second question. What is the added value of global governance? It opens up research to issues which were not researched before. It's a new paradigm that brings new agendas, new areas, and so on and so forth. I will consider it that way. Now, in a way of definition, what is important for definitions? I work on them for the morning on two elements, connotation and denotation. Right. But there has to be also logical consistency. Andres was very right to say the question here is the object, not the objective. What is the object here? What is the subject? Governance, no global. Global is an objective. So if the name is governance, it has to be called constant across levels. So the meaning of governance has to be constant at the global, regional, and state level. Right? What is the trick here? To find a definition that can travel across levels. So what would be a definition of governance? You could say, I try to associate it very much with economics definition, but comes back to political science, which is governance is about the mechanism, the instruments for providing public goods.
Yes.
So simple as that.
Yes.
But don't forget, this kind of definitions comes back to the systems theory. What is the function of politics to provide certain outputs? Yes. So basically, we haven't moved very much. We have changed of the words. Now, what is different between national, regional, and global governance? It's the level. Basically, and the level implies a different combination of actors and instruments.
Yes.
That's what is there.
Yes.
You don't need really to elaborate about globalization and so on and so forth. And in this respect, Derek is very right. It is a very old concept. Before we talk about the world system, you remember this beautiful expression, the world system, implying that there has been some mechanism for understanding the outputs of the world system. Now we talk about global governance.
Right.
Basically, so what is the added value? It attracts attention to new areas of research.
Right.
But the definitional problems are not for global governance, are not for international relations, sorry. It's a question about defining properly governance. Do not forget, governance differently to regimes is a term that is very much used in law and in economics. And in that respect, it's an interdisciplinary concept. It cannot be appropriated only from the point of view of statistic. So that's my contribution to the discussion.
That's fine.
And if you may allow me, at the end, I would like to introduce a sentence that summarizes very much my thinking about concepts to add some more strength on that.
Can I add something? Because I think that, I agree with many of the things that were said and disagree with others, but I think that, this normative thing is interesting, so what is the added value after distinguish? But I think one way of being even kind of try to be more concise would be to say ways of managing or dealing with the global commons or globality, if you want to. Especially global commons, which comes together this idea that it's really things that you have to manage at the global level.
Yes.
That you cannot do it at the national or
But the challenge there is to define specifically. You want to be very precise is which are the kind of global goods, global values that we want.
The global commons imply airspace, air.
That's the global commons.
That's the kind of global commons, global goods, and you can include there even things that are coming from the old theory system, like for example, how you include values there. Values are kind of mechanism.
The second observation has to do with what Andres said, and I want to kind of disagree with him. Which I think is, you always have the problem of distinguishing, and this is, I think, a crucial problem or limitation in terms of global governance, distinguishing in normative and analytic, in the sense of, okay, can you have government or governance without proper authority, without legitimacy? So can you keep the politics out of it and the authority or the normative, dimension out of it? I'm not sure if you will be able. I mean, we can do that analytically in terms of definition, but I think it's always a problem because people will say this is not legitimate.
Right. And I think that you need legitimacy and authority. This is back to the previous discussion we had about regional power. So let me refer very quickly to your comments, and then I can quote a couple of definitions, and it will sound very familiar to you at this stage after 1 hour of discussion. So, Andres, I think that what is global, it's different from what is transregional. I think what is global, it's more in the direction of what Eduardo was saying, that it's universal or cosmopolitan or belongs to everybody. So in terms of level of analysis, It's different from international. And some people, what's the name? David Held, I think, or in the UK, they talk about global politics today. We should move from international relations to global politics, right?
You have Acharya, global IR.
Right? So, well, Acharya is mainly all the levels, right? Because he probably talked about regions as well. But you got the definition, it's a process of making and enforcing collective goods. What Eduardo added, and I think it's that you have to address global problems, right? And you come from your frame of reference, which is global environmental issues, but it could be nuclear proliferation or whatever, right? And I think that also everybody's right now, right? That the UN has remained the embodiment of this idea of global governance. I mean, there is even a journal called Global Governance where they celebrate the UN and multilateralism and so on and so forth, right? And I think, Carlos, you also asked a wonderful question that even if we think about global governance normatively, right, it does not necessarily have to be a good thing. I have a colleague from Eastern America working in Switzerland, James Davis, right? And he has a short article where he trashes global governance. And he says that the problem with global governance, as you say, it's the problem of democratic deficit. The same argument you can make about globalization or about the EU, right? It's, I mean, you have a problem of democratic deficit, and you have other problems as well. Okay? So just to wrap, I mean, to give you, to quote, right? That's what we do, academics, where we quote, right? So I have here the definition given by a commission of the UN in 1995 about governance in general. And they say it's the sum of the many ways individuals, institutions, public and private, manage their common affairs. It's a continuing process through which conflicting or diverse interests may be accommodated and cooperative action may be taken. It includes formal institutions and regimes empowered to enforce compliance, as well as informal arrangements that people and institutions either have agreed to or perceive to be in their interests. One. Another one, what Weiss and Thakur wrote, 2010, global governance is the sum of laws, norms, policies, and institutions that define, constitute, and mediate transborder relations among citizens, society, markets, and the state in the international arena, the wielders of objects of international public power. Okay? Another one, John Ruggie. John Ruggie is a big name because he also, it's not only an academic, he also was in charge of the World Compact, right? Trying to domesticate the multinational corporations. So governance refers to the workings of the system of authoritative rules, norms, institutions, and practices by means of which any collectivity manages its common affairs. Okay? So in a sense, all those definitions reflect the collective wisdom of this group. It's not very different, and in a sense, this is the definition, by the way, of governance that you can play with that at the global level and the regional level. Whether this resolves those issues, of course it's not, but that's more or less what I had to say and run for my session, right, to justify the ticket to Lisbon. Thank you very much.
Andres, I am allowed perhaps to read something which I think is relevant in this context. And the paper I presented this morning is going to be published next week, will be online, at least due to the website. And the paper starts with a quotation from an author, but it's not an academic author. It's a British author which wrote a wonderful book, translation in English. The original title in English, I think, is Alice Through the Window, or Through the Blood. So in Spanish, it's Alicia Through the Desperto, and in Portuguese, it's Zombies. Lewis Carroll, the author, was a mathematician. The mathematicians are very good in logic. And there is a passage in Alice's story in which Alice meets this character, Humpty Dumpty, which is this egg sitting in the book, right? And there is a conversation between the two of them that encapsulates very much what is about the concept. So let me read it for you. It's just 3 sentences. It starts with Humpty Dumpty says, when I use a word, says in a rather scornful tone, it means just what I choose to mean, neither more or less. The question, says Alice, is whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, says Anti-Dante, which is to be the master? That's all. So at the end, definition is about power. Right? If you don't have neutralized definitions, what is there is a power game about who owns the object. And do not forget that the Bible says very clearly that God gave the power to men to name animals, to own them. So there is something about creative concepts, using them for some kind of powerful reasons.
Okay, that's a nice summary. We want to talk about concepts, right?
Yes, because
they change
I'm taking notes of what you said. Well, if you have any questions about James Bond or whatever.
One there?
No question about the value added for the governments. You can publish a journal for the governments.
And you earn some money.
We have a journal called Global Constitution, in which I
Are there any questions that you want to
I can ask him directly.
I wanted to ask a question.
I have a piece of information regarding logistics and...
I don't know.
Where is the restaurant?
Not exactly.
The big question is where is the restaurant?
Question?
I don't have any
Pedro?
No.
No? Anyone? Any more questions?
You want me to tell why you wrote about James Bond?
Yes, please.
Yes,
In a minute? Although
No.
it was never published. I mean, I tried to publish that article. I guess in IR it's difficult when you want to exercise some sense of humor. But if you, I mean, I guess many of us are fans of the James Bond movies, that they start in 59, more or less, or 60. So in a sense, they reflect the evolution of IR. And James Rosenau, we talk about Rosenau a lot, he wrote in 2000 a small piece in foreign policy called The Spy Who Loved Globalization. And why is that? Because James Bond, before we start talking about globalization, when you look at the enemies, they were non-spectators, right? They were, in a sense, the embodiment, right? Not the traditional state enemies. And so the villains in the movies reflect the evolution of international relations, right? Always play with the idea of one day writing a book called IR 007, right? Instead of IR 101.
Can I say something? Just to remember a very interesting book from 1999 that was North, the Californian internationalist. I don't remember the first name, but the word was War, Peace, Survival, Global Policy and Conceptual Synthesis, 1999. And he was talking, I mean, a lot about the limitations of the levels of words, the individual, the state, and the international, and talking about the global. And the global was mostly all the things that are where the international were related to the common source, the biosphere of the planet. Okay? Generally speaking, what we call environmental growth. And at that moment, we had a very interesting pioneer approach to what would be global governance right now in the second half of the future of the 21st century. He was saying humanity could go ahead with the global governance or not, we don't know. I mean, of course he was in favor of building up global governance. He said this is key for humanity. If there is no building up, we will fail completely as a species, and even we will finish as a species.
So that came as a closing speech. Thank you, Eduardo.
Yeah, Peter is coming. No, I was preparing to fill in space so that you could give that. No, but I just thought of a nice sentence also, which I sometimes use in my kind of methodology thing, which is by C. Wright Mills. And it's something like, it's a kind of a Christian thing, or a Christian approach. But it's basically this idea that concepts for the researcher, not researcher for concepts. You should not, you should make sure that they are useful for your research, not to try to force your research into some kind of conceptual structure. But Peter is already here, so.
I only have this information. I don't know if you want to.
Global governance.
Local governance. Before you to close down close the week. Just those who want to go to a hotel afterwards will meet up there, or someone will meet up you there at 8 o'clock. If not, we'll just wait a bit and I'll print out some maps for you to get to the restaurant. Please be sure to give me the evaluation forms in case you've lost them. I have extra lines here.
Just do that.
And I think that's it.
Yeah.
So evaluation is just for students.
The evaluation forms? They are, but if you want to fill them out.
It's useful for you.
Yeah. We are going to organize several other workshops during the coming years, so it's good to know what well and
for internal PRIMO purposes.
But you're very welcome to fill them out.
I will do if it is good for you. Otherwise,
we cannot list them because the samples are different. So if
Yes, they are anonymous.
But they are anonymous.
They are anonymous.
In terms of analytical rigor,
Vero, just one more word before you stand up. I'd
no,
like to.
I was going to take
That's an automatic, it's Pavlovian.
I just want to say a few words while this happens there. I'd like to, on behalf of all of us, say a big thank you to the organizers of this week. It's been a pleasure, and not only because of the great food we received and all the excellent organizing, but also because of the content of the workshop, which was excellent, and I'm really, really grateful to have been here with you, and I think that it's something that we all share.
I don't know whether Bruno wants to say something, but I will speak for Bruno and Pedro as well. We are so happy to have you here. In Lisbon, we are going to make you drunk tonight. We are going to toast for PRIMO project and for INSA, which are going to accompany us tonight. That will be the next time. Thank you very much to everybody.
Yeah.
To the